Welcome to Rodney Veal's Inspired By, a production of Public Media Connect, the regional partnership of CET in Cincinnati and Think TV in Dayton. Rodney Veal, our host for this podcast, is an independent choreographer, interdisciplinary artist, and all-around fan of all things arts and creativity, and he's excited to share another great conversation with you. Thank you for listening, and if you enjoy the show, please subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
I'm super excited to share a conversation with Jonathan McNeal, who is a filmmaker, the general manager of the Neon Movies, and philanthropist in our community, to talk about all things film and his life in general as inspiration for moving forward and making positive change. So, Jonathan, okay, I have to know. I had a dream as an art maker to be a visual artist. Did you have the dream of being always in film?
In film, in some capacity, sure. It certainly didn't end up exactly the way I had thought about. But, the interest in film really took flight with The Wizard of Oz. And my adoration of that film and collecting stuff when I was little. I loved the film. I loved the annual screening on TV of the film. But then a librarian, Mrs. Hilditch, in the children's library, pointed me to other Oz books, and then eventually to a book called The Scrapbook of Oz. And I was enamored that there were things to collect and that there was a story. And then she said, I think you're ready to go to the adult section of the library. And she wrote me a little tag so that I could go upstairs to the adult library and get out a book called The Making of the Wizard of Oz by Algene Harmetz. And it was, completely eye-opening. The whole idea of the casting process and special effects and directors changing hands and, all the behind the scenes of the creation of this film really opened my eyes to the fact that it was a business and that it was a work that took multiple people to see it, to gestate and to become a reality. So that was a whole new idea to me. It wasn't just people putting on a show. It was a lot of people making it happen.
I love the fact that that your journey started in the library, which is because for me, it was a very similar story of going to the library and checking out books and seeing these images of dance and visual arts and thinking, this is kind of the world I wanted to be in. And so part of this podcast is that inspiration. And I love the fact that it's the Wizard of Oz. It doesn't get any better than that. So once you discovered the Wizard of Oz and you discovered this book about the making of, did it just take over? Did it become sort of an obsession of how film and films are made for you?
Oz took over for sure. Oz became a big part of my life. I was collecting stuff. I was, eventually in '89 was the 50th anniversary of the movie, and more books came out and more kind of stuff became available. And so I started meeting authors, and then I went to conventions, met authors, and ended up meeting Munchkins at one point. I was 16 years old going on a plane by myself to Racine, Wisconsin, to people that owned ruby slippers and things like that. Oz took over my life, but also the notion of film certainly did too. I was from a small town, Salem, Ohio, so small town, not a whole lot of resources when it came to film. We did not even own a VCR until I was in high school. It was always one of those, you could rent a VCR for the weekend with 3 movies for $10 kind of thing.
Okay.
And we didn't have a camcorder, never had one of those. So I never really had my hands on a camera to really kind of understand film before I decided I wanted to go to film school. And, being a middle-class family, my parents were not interested in sending me anywhere outside of state. So we had to find somewhere in state. And that's where, even in junior high, I had determined that Wright State was the best film program in the state, and that's where I was probably going to go for college. So, I kind of knew by 8th grade that that's the direction I wanted to go.
I love that. And that was my next question, because you did land at Wright State, which I do also consider probably one of the best film schools in the state. It is very clear to me that you went through the process, which is like discovery. You knew and you understood in the 8th grade, so you were leading yourself up to it. So now you've applied to Wright State's film program. You're there. What was that experience like for you if you've never touched a camera and you've only dealt with film on a renting of a VCR for $10 a
Right.
weekend?
Right. Interestingly, we came to look at the university first, my mother and I remember Joe Hill, the equipment room manager at the time, taking us on a tour, seeing kids working on Steenbecks, which are those reel-to-reel machines where people were editing 16 millimeter film and working with sound and film at the same time. And it was all really fascinating to me. But the guy, Joe, was honest and said, a lot of people apply to this program and don't make it, don't make it all the way through. And, there was a bit of a reality check kind of giving us some numbers and knowing that dozens and dozens of people would apply and even start the program and then not make it to the junior year. So then incoming as a freshman, realizing that there were 100 plus kids who had declared that motion pictures was going to be their major, and knowing that the cut would be to about 9 to 12 people in the junior year, immediately some people bailed, right away. And the coursework was tough. There's a lot of as much theory as there was hands-on practical filmmaking. But, I remember going home from that visit with my mother in the car and saying, well, I'm going to be one of those people that goes all the way with it. And, so she's an artist too. She was a musician. She's a keyboard artist, piano, harpsichord, organ. And she's always said to me, the arts are feast or famine. You've got to really want to do it if that's what you want to do. So, but I was adamant that I would make it through the program.
Wow. I mean, I love the fact that you've, in my knowledge of you and knowing you and having met you, you always seem to be very focused, like, and very determined, like unfazed. I mean, that would scare most people. The notion that 100 people show up and only 9 survive. That is like, those odds are pretty,
Sure.
are not not in your favor. I mean,
Right. No, it is a little daunting. And, I will have to say I did have beyond VHS. My father had, when we were very, very little, used a Super 8 camera. So he never used it when I was interested in it. I mean, it wasn't really, it was kind of falling out of fashion for sure. But we had those reels of Super 8 movies at home. And I loved threading that projector. I loved projecting the film onto the back of a white door. I loved that whole process and the clicking and clacking of these silent films that we would watch. And I almost kind of forgot that was something that I really loved at home. And I would rent movies from the library. They had Super 8 movies. They would have silent reels of, Disney stuff, or maybe like a boiled down, 20-minute version of Mary Poppins kind of thing, but it was silent. You were watching this with no sound, but I still was fascinated by it. So when I got to film school, that was the very first thing you shot on was Super 8. So I had some understanding of frames and sprockets and, how things kind of worked in that regard. But it was all new to me as far as aperture settings and lenses and understanding depth of field and all those kinds of things that go into shooting on film. So all of that was a big learning curve for me.
Okay. So, and you talked about theory, because that's one of the things when I went to school for dance, theory took over from technique. Because this is a podcast for people who are hopefully going to get inspired to maybe say, you know what, like, I'm not going to be so afraid of my child going to film school or being a dancer or an artist. What would you say because it sounds like your parents are really supportive also as well. So it's a 2-pronged question. What would you say to those people out there who are interested in maybe pursuing film and filmmaking, and also to parents and or individuals who support young people who are trying to do it? What would you tell them?
Well, certainly things have become a lot more accessible in the last 20 years, and in the last 5 or 6 years, everybody has a camera now, on their hip. The understanding of the moving image and how to edit it and all that stuff is a lot more accessible than it was before. So, I'd urge people to start exploring with the tools that you have. Of my class, a few are working in the industry and most aren't. So it is still a risk, but you've got to take it to know whether it's for you or not. And you might not, you might find that, pre-production for a film takes as long as shooting. The shooting part is the shortest part. Pre-production and post-production are the things that really take the most time. So if you don't have that patience and that commitment and that investment, then it's not going to work for you. So it's fun to have as a hobby, but if you're not really 100% wanting to make it work, then you've got to do something else. But you've got to try it to know if it's for you or not.
Yeah, and I think that's really good advice. I mean, and so one of the things that because you talked about going to right state, and we just we're kind of all processing the fact that Julia Reicher's passing in film, and in the Dayton community, not just in the Dayton community but in the film community, it's very clear her impact and influence. And I saw the article in the Dayton Daily News where there was a quote from you about talking about authenticity in film, because it's that question of telling the truth. And so for those who didn't read the article, I want you to could you encapsulate that?
I knew her peripherally in my freshman and sophomore year, but she and Jim Klein, who were teaching together at the time, you didn't really have time with them until you made the cut into the junior year. And that's when you were going into a saturation of documentary work. And, I knew Julia. I knew that she had an incredible resume. I knew that, she had films that were quite revered, but I hadn't seen them growing up. They certainly weren't films that were available at the video store. And that first day of class was her looking around the room saying, if you were in a long-term committed relationship, okay. But if you weren't, if you were just dating, stop dating. If you had a job, quit your job. You are going to have to focus on this class, and it's going to be so demanding, and you're going to have so many projects that there's no room for outside commotion. And in dating in particular, she was like, that's that's going to add to your drama where you can't get the work done. And going into the junior year, you had to have a checkbook that showed that you have X numbers of dollars in the checkbook so that you could actually do the work, afford the work, because in that quarter you were shooting on video and whatnot, but eventually you're going to be shooting on film, and there was a huge expense that came along with that. So she looked around the room, she told us those things, and then she also said, I can tell by your shoes, I can tell by your haircuts that you are all Midwestern. And she's like, and you've got to embrace that. You've got to embrace your upbringing, embrace your roots, know who you are. Otherwise, your work isn't going to be authentic. And you've got to invest yourself in your work, and you need to know who you are in order to create good work. That was ultimately kind of the curtain speech to the class. And then we started working. We started learning interview techniques, and then started, portrait work, and just a variety of stuff that we were, every week in a 10-week course, we had some kind of project due. And some of them were big projects. When you came out of that program, you ended up having a resume like an NYU student at the end of the day, like an NYU grad student, really. I mean, you weren't making feature films, but you had a junior thesis and a senior thesis. They've since kind of whittled down what the requirements are to get through the program. It's not as much requirement as it used to be, but it's still a demanding program for sure. But back then you had to really commit to quite a bit to actually graduate.
I love how you said it was like it's comparable at that time to an NYU. I mean, I have a master's degree in choreography, and I did the similar sort of process of like a project plus 3 thesis statements plus
Right.
many projects along the way. And as I always tell people all the time, it's like hold on to your hats. I've never really, heard of bachelor programs being that intense, but it seems like film school seems to be the most intense of the art forms in that
You know,
sense.
and it is a pretty non-traditional film school. I mean, that whole cut rate and, whittling down to those kind of 9, 10 students by the junior year, there was a real kind of sense of family at that point. I mean, you knew each other, you were working together, you were collaborating with fellow students, you were getting a lot of time in the editing room with Jim Klein. You were, people were really facilitating the work, and you really got to know everyone around you. And upperclassmen maybe going to them for help, and you helping them on their projects, et cetera. So there was always, and there wasn't a real stringent requirement to graduate anytime soon. I mean, they knew that the junior film that you were working on could cost thousands of dollars, and you might have to work some to get the next, couple reels of film that you needed to shoot, or work some to take the next step in post-production to do your sound mix, or, to do a release print of your film for color correction. That all of those steps were so much more expensive than they are these days. Being able to shoot on a camera where you can upload it to your computer and not have to send it away for processing and edge coding and all these kinds of things that come along with 16 millimeter, which is what we were shooting on that junior year.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
so it was different. It was a different era.
Different era, but a different era that still kind of leads into today. I see film in essence, an artifice. It's an artificial form, but there has to be an authenticity within that artifice. So does that kind of affect how you see films and in what you're doing now? But because which we'll get to, but does that kind of allow you to see films and filmmaking in a different lens versus just an everyday patron?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, my boyfriend says when people ask him if he's in film as well, or if he's interested in films, and he says he likes movies, he responds and says, "I like movies. Jonathan likes films." He knows that my tastes are a little more demanding when it comes to quality, um, and authenticity and things like that. It's not to say that I can't enjoy, a mainstream film, but it's pretty rare.
I guess it's very similar to someone in the dance field who's like, you could tolerate a nutcracker, but you would, but you would prefer to see something else, especially in the ballet room. You could tolerate it, but that's the thing. So, and I know we had talked briefly before we had this interview, and you mentioned a film which turned out to be one of my favorite films. I own it, the Criteria DVD. That's how much I love the film, Maurice, and you talked about that being very influential. And what was so influential about that film? Because I wanted to go in depth about that.
So,
I laid it.
I had seen Room with a View on VHS, and my friend Betsy Kahn, who sat behind me in German class, had also seen it and loved it. And I loved Room with a View, and should have been very telling. Is very engaged by Maggie Smith and Judi Dench, and then I found out that those same filmmakers made another film and called Morris, and I rented that and watched it and was slightly horrified by it being a very queer story, and the gay content in it was unabashedly gay content in it. And I found myself not being able to talk to Betsy about having seen that film because I didn't want any kind of suspicion or guilty by association kind of from having seen that film. But I watched it a couple times even, and I was so engaged by the story, also titillated by it a little. It was something I had never seen. It was completely eye-opening to me. It made me be interested in E.M. Forster, started reading some of his short stories as well. And then, of course, when Howard's End came out a few years later, I was
Mhm.
living in Germany at the time. That has become one of my all-time favorite films. I just think it's an exquisite piece of work, from performance and screenplay and photography is just all lovely.
I had the similar sort of feeling about the film when I first saw it. But then, and being almost 60 years old, which is, I'm not afraid to unabashedly say that the storyline, it was the most authentic sort of exploration of love, of a seeking quest for love. And I thought these filmmakers really captured that sort of inner conversation, that inner dialogue, but it manifests itself in visual terms. And I just always fell in love with the film. And of course, we talked about the fact that Howard's End, I mean, full caveat for those who don't know me, I was at the Neon Movies working as assistant manager when Howard's End came out, which was like kind of crazy and insane in and of itself. Watching people really gravitate towards this movie. I mean,
And I recall the Neon doing a 70 millimeter presentation at one point too of Howard's End, which was pretty incredible.
Yeah. Those are, and the Merchant Ivory films. It was this introduction, and I just remember, and we think about queer cinema, we think about as how now we're having these conversations of marginalized folks and individuals and their voices being now finally heard. It's like, I think it's just really exciting. So is there any film that you've seen recently that gave you that similar effect, like watching Maurice?
You mean an effect of just awakening or love, or what kind of
Well,
searching for?
kind of a continuation of that kind of representation in queer cinema.
Well, I adore the film Carol by Todd Haynes, which also a period piece. You know, I love the film for all that it is, visually and performances again, but I also love what it what it was, in that it was the first novel written where the lesbian protagonist could live their lives at the end. And that's, pretty groundbreaking to think that in the 50s, until the 50s, we'd never read source material that was allowing, you had to be incarcerated or put in a mental institution or commit suicide. I mean, you couldn't exist as an out lesbian until the mid 50s, as far as literature was concerned. So Children's Hour, all these other films that, I adore, and stories that I love, they're tragic endings. So I love that Carol has that permission slip, and why Patricia Highsmith continued to receive letters until her death from people reading that book and feeling seen in some way, and feeling a certain allowance to be who they were, is really powerful. And I think it resonates in the film too. And that last glance at the very last frame is just pretty wonderful.
Oh no, it absolutely. So we're going to take a little short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk to Jonathan about all the things that go into running a movie theater.
I'm Bonnie Miles, Membership Coordinator of CET. Thank you for listening to Rodney Veal's Inspired By. This podcast is a production of CET and Think TV, two local PBS stations. As PBS stations, the work we do online, on air, and in the community is supported by listeners like you. If you're enjoying the show and would like to support our work, please consider becoming a member at cetconnect.org or thinktv.org. Plus, when you sign up to donate at least $5 a month, you'll get access to special members-only streaming videos on the PBS app through Passport. Learn more at cetconnect.org or thinktv.org. Thanks for listening, and back to the show.
So, okay, we are back with Jonathan McNeal, and a filmmaker in his own right, but also runs one of the most amazing spaces, creative spaces, the Neon Movies in Dayton, Ohio. And so, Jonathan, we were talking about films. We were talking about Carol, which was filmed in the region, by the way, which we have a robust film industry in Southwest Ohio, which a lot of people don't know. And so how much contact or engagement do you have with those filmmakers who are coming in to make work within the region?
Not a whole lot. Carrie O'Reilly, who is a graduate of the Wright State program, is a producer, and she has had her hand in a lot of the projects that have come through the region. So I really don't, the films are often kind of quiet. They might do some extra casting. There's some buzz about, who's in town, who's doing what. But there isn't a lot of, I think that they can really kind of avoid the paparazzi and whatnot that might happen in a bigger market. There's still a little bit of that when there's big name stars, but there's been a lot of work come through the area lately. Luca Guadagnino has done Bones and All around Ohio with Timothy Chalamet, and Noah Baumbach was in Ohio last year with Greta Gerwig and Adam Driver, and a lot of big things have happened around here. But unfortunately, they're at work and working, focused on a project that is coming to fruition, as opposed to being here during a time when their work is going out into the world. And being an exhibitor, I'm the contact person when you have work to show, as opposed to being the person when you have work to do. When Todd Haynes was in town with Carol, I had bought the book Price of Salt, which Carol is based on. Subsequent printings ended up calling it Carol instead of Price of Salt. But I had bought that book when I was at the Toronto International Film Festival in the fall that year, and had read it and loved it, and then found out that Todd Haynes, who I adore, was going to be in Cincinnati shooting the film with Cate Blanchett, who I adore, based on a novel that I adore. I mean, it was like a trifecta of people that I had to be a part of. And I heard that Carrie was working on it in some capacity, and I reached out to her, and she said I should apply to be an extra. And, she sent me some details as to who to contact. And the first thing was show up in as 1950s era costume as you can. And, I was all about it. I love to play dress up. That's a whole nother activity to go into. So I showed up, went back for a second look-see, found out that a picture of me from what I wore to that first kind of camera test thing was on a wall in the wardrobe shop. And at that second look-see, there were people running around with tape measures around their necks, and sewing machines were whizzing, and there were racks and racks and racks of vintage costumes. And, there's Sandy Powell, Oscar winner, running around. There's, it was amazing. And so I ended up working on the film for 5 days, getting to see Todd Haynes at work, which was amazing. Doing scenes. My very first scene was, I was in a phone booth, I was beside the phone booth. Someone was coming out of the phone booth, and we did some rehearsal, and I was kind of navigating if I was supposed to walk in front of her or behind her. And the young woman said, I don't know. And then I found out that the reason she didn't know is because that was going to be Cate Blanchett, and she was standing in for her doing the rehearsal work. So my very first day on set was whisking past Cate Blanchett as she comes out of a phone booth. So, it was pretty magical, and to be on that set and watch it come together in that way.
Oh, that is so super cool. I mean, the fact that you have this affection for Cate Blanchett, and you get an opportunity to kind of pass each other,
right,
so to speak. I'm touched by the grace of genius in that regard, because I'm a fanboy as well for Kate's work.
Yeah,
just absolutely. So I have a question, because a lot of times, I don't know if you feel this way, that sometimes you may not love a film, but you love the performance, some performances in it. Does that happen?
Oh, absolutely. That happens. You can come away from something and say, oh, she was great, but yeah, I won't revisit it. or he was great,
Right,
you know.
right.
Yeah, that definitely happens. And I think that it's happened even to the point where somebody might get recognized Oscar-wise, and that's the only nomination, that's the only, it didn't do much business, it didn't do whatever, but somebody, might get a nomination for it.
Yeah, that's kind of a thing. And so, I love the fact that you've kind of had this experience with Carol, which is, Patricia's Highsmith's novel, Price of Salt. But then you also mentioned the Toronto Film Festival, which was one of my questions, because you get the chance, because you are an exhibitor, you are showing the films, you get to go to the Toronto Film Festival, which I'm jealous of the fact that you get to find and explore things, because I think as an art maker, artists always have a tendency to gravitate towards independent films and film because it informs their work. And so they're always looking for something that speaks to their curiosity and piques their curiosity.
Right. And film is ultimately referred as the ultimate art form, in that it can contain everything. It can contain dance. It can contain, it does
music.
It is photography, it's music, it's performance, it's set design, it's, it's all of those things, in one piece. What can be lacking is the live piece that would come with being at a space and watching a performance or watching a dance. But ultimately, I do really think that film can encapsulate everything.
So in an encapsulation, you've gone to Toronto. And so this past year, we've come out of the pandemic. Did you go to Toronto?
I did not. I have not been since 2019. And it's,
oh, wow.
2020 was COVID. 2021 was, they were trying to do a real hybrid of, very minimal attendance and a lot of virtual. And this past year, they still did some virtual and still did some in person, but I was not ready yet. I usually book my flights in like April or May for Toronto. And at that point, they were still requiring COVID tests to do international flights. And I decided that every year in Toronto, I get sick in some capacity. Everybody does. If you are there and you're seeing, 35, 40 films in a, 9-day stretch, and going to the parties and staying up late and writing your blog and all those things, you're bound to get sick. So I just felt like it was still not the right time to book a flight for me. And so I'm really hoping to get back in 2023, as my soul has really been missing being kind of just really saturated in new material. And, I hope that I feel comfortable enough to do that this year.
I hope so too. I mean, it must be it has to be difficult to make those kind of choices for picking the slate of films if you're not having that tangential experience, that sort of like, I mean.
And what Toronto is really valuable about is you're seeing it with an audience too. So for traditional engagements, I have an opportunity to see, for most films, see the films in advance. So whether they're at home or they're a trade screening where I'll drive to Cincinnati and I'll see a movie in a theater the way it's supposed to be seen, I have my issues. I'll go to a theater and I feel like, oh, that bulb could be brighter. And, I feel like it's a little muddy on screen, or the sound quality isn't good, or, I have to go out and tell the projectionist to change the aspect ratio, or those kinds of, so that can be frustrating. And it's also often me by myself in a trade screening. So there is an obligation for distributors. They have to make the films available for us to see in the state of Ohio. There are certain states that have a law on the books that says that we have to have an opportunity to see the films before they come out. Some distributors will go as far as doing a theatrical, and some will just send you a link to watch at home. But that's an old law from, I want to say, like the 30s or 40s, that came out with what was called blind booking and block booking and whatnot, where they would say, yeah, you can play The Wizard of Oz, but you have to play these other 3 turkeys that you're not going to have any opportunity to see or know what to market or whatever. But, you can have our crown jewel this season, but if you want it, it comes with parameters. And so that law is still on the books, and it's to my benefit. But at the same time, I miss seeing those films in an audience, which is really, to me, how film is meant to work.
I would agree, because there's certain movies that I reserve for home,
Mhm.
There's certain films, to your point, that you want to see on a screen. And so I totally get that. But the fact that the process is still governed by notions of film as commerce. And so, we always talk about, we talk about the beauty, the joy and the beauty of film, but you are in the exhibition business as well. You talked about it being a business. So you've got to strike a balance between something that's really fulfilling from an audience and film going experience, as well as something that's gonna do well in your theater.
Oh,
So
absolutely. And people are taking a lot less risks after COVID. I mean, our audience still isn't back. We're still struggling at the Neon.
mhm,
It's to make ends meet. It's hard. I've been at the theater for 21 years now. The first couple years were rocky. Then we started to make a dent in some of the debt we had. Then we were debt free for a while, and then we were in the black for a long time and many years. And since 2020, we have not been. And it is just it's upsetting. It's still losing sleep over it sometimes. I mean, but people just aren't coming back to the cinemas. And that's a national issue. It's not just the
mhm.
Neon, and our film buyer actually has told me that we're doing a lot better than a lot of the other art houses
Wow.
out there.
Wow.
So we are, but I feel like I've been treading water for the last 2.5 years by doing all these kind of special events and one night only events. And, you do a one night only event, it still requires hours worth of, in some cases you're downloading the material at home overnight, then you're putting it on the proper drive and making sure that it can be ingested into the server, and then you're doing a marketing plan for it, and you're all for one night in hopes that that does some business. So you can't do that all the time, otherwise I'd need a much bigger team, and that's more money, and we don't have it. So it's a vicious circle in that regard. But film is commerce, and like I said, people are taking less risks, a lot less interest in films with subtitles these days. International film is a really hard sell. It was always a challenge in our market, but there were always films that you were certain that could do some business, an Amelie or a Motorcycle Diaries, or films like that. So Spanish and French, but any kind of language, Middle Eastern, other languages, stuff from Africa, they were almost impossible to sell before, and now there's just very little interest in supporting something that you've not been inundated with marketing for. And that's only going to be the mainstream films right now. The only films doing business out in the marketplace are Top Gun and Marvel movies, and that's it. We've seen some glimmers of hope from films that I think are incredible, like Tar with Blanchett, Todd Field's film. It did well, not great, but I feel like in pre-2020 that would have been, our banner film for the year. But now it, does some good business week 1 and fizzles by week 2 and is gone by week 3. So it's upsetting, but we're still doggy paddling like we need to until things potentially get better.
And and that's another reason why we're hopefully with this podcast, in our small way, I will definitely make sure, so folks who are listening to the podcast, there will be in the show notes a place where you can go to the link to the Neon movies. Come on, folks, show some support and love. And that's with all art forms, and I've talked about that. And so we recognize the dog paddling. I love the fact that you're still in it. You didn't throw your hands up.
Right.
You're this is
I
gonna
mean,
be
and
this is
this year we had to do, we're doing an annual fund. And I loved never having to do that. I loved, never having to ask for money outside, just for people to, ask for some generosity to help make ends meet. I loved when we were in the black and we didn't have to do that, except for maybe an occasional, we're replacing our seats and this is going to be astronomical. Can people help? And when we do that, people would really jump up and say, I want to be a part of that. But now it's like, we need to make ends meet to pay our staff, to turn the lights on. And so that's a little more disheartening, but it's the truth of it.
that goes to that point of authenticity. We can't just talk about the joy of films and the artistry without saying that this is a factor in your daily existence. And so we're going to do that. So I know we're going to pivot a little bit. We're going to kind
Okay.
of slide
All
into,
right.
because we talked about the films and doing the slate, but I'm kind of curious, like, what would surprise most people as to what your favorite film is? Like a surprise film that people would go, I never would have thought that that's the film that Jonathan really is one of his favorites.
When people ask me what my favorite film is, there's a list. It's a challenge to narrow it down to one. But when people ask for one, I do say The Umbrellas of Cherbourg, just because it's one that I can have on in the background and not even be focusing on. And this is a French musical from 1964 with Catherine Deneuve, and it is by Jacques Demy, and it is sung from beginning to end in French. And I think the surprise would be I don't speak French, and this is my favorite film. And I can sing along to it, but I have no idea what I'm saying. I mean, I have, a gist of what's being said, but ultimately I don't speak French. But I adore the film. I love the color palette. I love the story. It's a little romantic, a dash of cheese perhaps in there, but I love it. And, that's one that I can watch over and over again. And when it comes to color palette and production design and whatnot, I immediately also go to Almodovar. So Almodovar, several films in his biography are favorites and on the top 10 list.
Wow, I love the fact that there's the Umbrellas of Cherbourg.
And I don't speak Spanish either. So
Yeah,
favorite
right.
films are Spanish and French, and I don't speak either. I speak German though. But,
You speak German, okay? It's like there's I love that because it's. I mean, I was thinking about that in my own top 10 list of films. And it evolves. It kind of rotates and changes,
Sure.
but then I thought about it. But there were two films that kind of stayed, and I really kind of speaks to my personality. I think the two that stuck: Singing in the Rain and Funny Face. Funny Face being number one.
And interesting that both of those are about being in the business in some way or another.
Yes, they are. They're about being in the business, but there's something about. I knew from you talked about singing and dancing, I mean, and that's why it's the power of film. It was seeing Gene Kelly dance and Fred Astaire dance, and I was like, could I do this? And I didn't start dancing until later in life, so this was kind of like a secret. It was like only I knew that I wanted to really dance versus being a visual artist. And so when I became a dancer, it's just like those were my role models. It was kind of very odd to be in the classical ballet realm to have your role models be Gene Kelly and Fred Astaire, but
but they're the best. Yeah, I
yeah.
get it. I get it. I love both of those films too, but I would have to say, I love that dance scene with Audrey in the cafe in Funny Face, which
That
is a little more modern. Yeah,
postmodern genius. Yes,
yeah.
with the black turtleneck. Yes.
But I also love Kay Ballard. Isn't it Kay Ballard? No, Kay Thompson.
Kay Thompson.
Yeah,
Yes.
that Think Pink number is one of my all-time favorite musical numbers. I love it. But I also, love a good dress and a good,
which speaks to the other part of you.
Yeah.
A lot of viewers don't know that you are Lisa Plymouth with the Ruby Girls. So I mean, it's a part of your persona. And I do you think that all of this, like being in the Ruby Girls and the Neon movies and this history of this journey that you've gone on, they're all kind of joined together in many ways?
There's threads that connect all of them. Absolutely. There's some tissue that is connected. I've had some folks urge me saying, you need to make another film, and I've written a little and I've thought about it and I've never taken the plunge, but there is still a part of me that would like to create film, but some things would have to change in my life to make that happen time-wise. But there is, with these things, working at the Neon and being able to be so close to films and filmmakers and, bringing their work to the public is valuable to me. And sharing the work that I adore is valuable with me. And then Ruby has this creative outlet where I'm allowed to create, a character and a number and a performance and, kind of speak to popular culture or politics or, those kinds of things. So there is kind of between all of those things, I feel like there are ways for me to express myself.
I know there are probably going to be individuals who are listening to the podcast going, what are the Ruby Girls? So if you could do the elevator speech to describe the Ruby Girls for folks who may not be aware.
Right. The Ruby Girls are a comedic drag troupe here in Dayton who are focused on philanthropy. So we've helped to raise over $2 million for various organizations in and around Ohio. Our main focus used to be HIV and AIDS, and now it's kind of broadened a bit. But it's comedic drag. And, I could, do another hour about drag and my relationship with drag, but and kind of internal homophobia growing up and all that. But it brings a lot of joy to a lot of people. And, we just did our big Thanksgiving show, 600 plus people at the arcade, over $7,000 in tips that night. People walking up to the stage and putting $1 bill in a drag queen's hand, or a $5 or a $20 or $100, but over $7,000 just in tips that night.
Wow.
So that really speaks to the community really being invested and engaged and believing in our mission.
That's so super cool. As we're bringing this conversation to a close, what I hope everyone takes away from this is the fact that you are so committed to all the things in your life that you are powerfully helping shape our community, one film at a time, one drag performance at a time, showing up and being a part of our community in a way that's just really special. And that's what I love, because it's rooted in that quietness, but it's wicked smart. As if I were from Boston or South Philly, wicked smart. And it's just really super cool to watch. I mean,
I appreciate that. And I will say that, I've had to do some of that cheerleading this year in order to do the annual fund. And, and so I'm going to give you some here. I am proud of what we accomplish at the Neon, and sometimes it's quiet. We had the world premiere, second screening world premiere of Till, the movie Till by Chinonye Chukwu. It was playing at the Lincoln Center for the New York Film Festival. They premiered it one night, then they were showing it the next afternoon. We were one of 6 theaters in the country to be a part of that, but we had to invite students. So it was students from DECA, students from Stivers and Wright State filled the house. They got to see the premiere of Till on our screen and then partake in a Q&A with the artists live from Lincoln Center streamed in. That kind of stuff is what I love. Saturday afternoons in the summer, over 400 kids came to see PBS Kids shows at the theater, walked home with free books in their hands. We do the holiday series where kids are in free, adults are $2. We do so many things. We work with so many artists throughout the year premiering their work. We work with so many philanthropic organizations who are out there using the cinematic arts to propel their missions and utilizing us to show the film and then do a Q&A or a community engaged conversation afterward. I don't have my notes in front of me, or I could riff off, a dozen, but over 60 one-time only screenings in 2022 alone. So, that's more than one a week. And those are the valuable things that are happening at the cinema beyond our day-to-day operations.
And that's what I love about it. I mean, it's just the fact that it's more than just the cinema, and that you embody that. And it's really super cool. So I encourage everyone to get your butts to go see films at the Neon Movies. It is life-changing. I mean, I really do feel that the power of cinema and film, and you've talked about it so eloquently, of what it does. And it's more than just the cinema. So, Jonathan,
well, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about it.
It's totally our pleasure. Totally our pleasure.
Rodney Veal's Inspired By is a production of Public Media Connect, the regional partnership of CET in Cincinnati and Think TV in Dayton. There's a lot of great art happening around Southwest Ohio, and we're excited to be part of it. If you like this episode, please subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can learn more and find the show notes at thinktv.org/inspired by or cetconnect.org/inspired by. Thank you.